He pulled a thick manila envelope from the inner pocket of his tailored navy suit and tossed it carelessly across the linen-draped table. It landed right next to the glowing candles of the chocolate birthday cake. "Happy 30th birthday, Makena." Makena, looking flawless in an elegant emerald green dress, picked up the envelope. To the rest of the room, it looked like a surprise gift. "You've been acting so on edge all evening, Henry," she murmured gently. "What could this possibly be?" "Open it," Henry demanded, his tone carrying a sharp, bitter edge. The low hum of the jazz quartet faltered and died. Over 100 of the city's most dangerous and influential guests, syndicate capos, corrupt politicians, and underworld elites invited to the exclusive high-rise banquet, turned their attention to the head table. Makena slid the document out of the envelope. The bold black letters at the top were impossible to miss. Divorce papers, just as depicted. But her smile didn't fade. It sharpened. Silence swallowed the sprawling, glass-walled banquet hall. Henry leaned heavily over the table, looming aggressively into her space as the glittering city skyline stretched out behind him. "I figured," he said loudly, his voice echoing off the marble floors, "there's no better time to tell the ruling council the truth." Gasps rippled across the room. One of the syndicate's older councilmen whispered fiercely, "Henry, have you lost your mind? Not tonight." "It's already done," Henry snapped, cutting the man off. He stood up straight, turning his back to Makena to address the room. He gestured toward the back of the hall, where a younger woman, his mistress, Elena, stepped out of the shadows. "For years, everyone at this table believed Makena was the foundation of my empire, that I needed her family's name to rule." He let out a dark, mocking laugh. "I don't." Makena slowly looked up from the papers. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She remained unnervingly, terrifyingly calm. "Henry," she said, her voice chillingly soft. "No," he interrupted, his voice booming over the anxious murmurs of the crowd. "I've spent years building this syndicate, brokering alliances and bleeding for this family, while shackled to a woman who contributes nothing. Effective immediately, I am taking sole control." The guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room suddenly shut with a resounding thud, and the locks clicked into place. Makena blinked slowly, her posture perfectly relaxed as she rested her hands on the table. "You think you built this empire, Henry?" "Oh, now you're going to argue?" Henry mocked, adjusting his cuffs with arrogant finality. "You planned the banquets, Makena. I controlled the streets." Henry paced the length of the head table, his voice swelling with the practiced cadence of a conqueror. "For 10 years, I've bled for the syndicate," he declared, throwing a hand toward the panoramic windows that overlooked the glittering city. "I negotiated the Dockland treaties. I buried the Rossi family. I turned a fractured alliance of street-level thugs into an untouchable corporate empire." He paused, letting the silence stretch before turning a look of utter disdain toward Makena. "And what did you do, Makena? You smiled for the cameras, you hosted the galas, you played the dutiful wife while I carried the weight of the underworld on my shoulders." Makena didn't flinch. She simply picked up her crystal champagne flute and took a slow, deliberate sip, her dark eyes locked on his. Her silence only seemed to fuel his arrogance. Henry reached out and grabbed Elena by the hand, pulling the younger woman forward into the light. Elena wore a clinging crimson gown, her chin tilted up in a practiced display of haughty confidence as she took her place at Henry's side. "This is Elena," Henry announced, his voice dropping to a theatrical, conspiratorial timbre as he addressed the ruling council seated at the front tables. "A woman who actually understands the cost of power. She doesn't flinch at the sight of blood, and she doesn't hide behind a dusty family name. With Elena by my side, we won't just hold the city. We will expand. We will crush the coastal cartels, and we will take everything." A heavy, suffocating tension settled over the room. The 5 elder bosses of the ruling council exchanged unreadable glances. Carlo, the eldest of the capos, adjusted his silver-handled cane, his expression grim. "Carlo," grunted Henry, his raspy voice cutting through the quiet. "You disrespect your wife in front of the families. You bring a stranger to our table on a night meant for loyalty. This is dangerous ground you walk." "The ground is mine to command, Carlo," Henry barked, his face flushing with defensive rage. "I am the boss of this family. I provide the wealth that fills your pockets. If any man in this room questions my authority or my choice of queen, he can step out those doors right now and consider himself an enemy of this syndicate." Henry sneered, puffing out his chest as he waited for the council to bow their heads and accept his absolute rule. He expected fear. He expected submission. But no one moved. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall remained firmly shut, the deadbolts having been locked securely in place moments before. The elite security guards lining the perimeter of the ballroom stood completely still, their faces carved from stone. Finally, Makena set her crystal champagne flute down on the white linen tablecloth. The soft clink of the crystal echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Are you quite finished, Henry?" she asked, her voice smooth as silk. Makena didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The quiet authority in her tone commanded the room far more effectively than Henry's shouting ever had. She picked up the thick manila envelope, slowly sliding the divorce decree back inside with a dismissive flick of her manicured fingers. "I asked you a question, Henry," she repeated, leaning back gracefully in her chair. Henry sneered, slamming his fist onto the table and making the silver cutlery rattle against the china. "You don't get to ask questions anymore. Your time is over. Sign the papers, Makena. Do it now, and maybe I'll let you leave this city with a generous severance. Refuse, and I will have my men drag you out into the street with nothing but the dress on your back." Elena smirked, leaning closer to Henry's shoulder, clearly relishing the public humiliation. Makena let out a soft, melodic laugh that sent a visible chill down the spines of the elder capos sitting at the front tables. She gently pushed the envelope across the linen tablecloth, stopping it just short of the glowing candles on her cake. "I don't think I will be signing anything tonight." Henry's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He turned toward the perimeter of the banquet hall, snapping his fingers sharply in the air. "Marcus," he barked at the towering head of syndicate security standing near the locked oak doors, "escort my ex-wife out of the building. If she resists, break her legs." The command hung in the heavy, breathless air of the banquet hall. Nobody moved. Marcus remained rooted to his spot, his cold eyes fixed forward, his hands resting comfortably on his tactical belt. The dozens of armed guards lining the walls, men Henry believed he had personally bought and paid for, stood like statues in the dim atmospheric lighting. "I said get her out of here," Henry roared, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a trembling finger at Makena. The synchronized metallic clatter of firearms being raised shattered the silence. Safeties clicked off in a lethal, echoing chorus. Henry's triumphant smile faltered as he turned around. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. Every single weapon in the room was drawn, but not a single barrel was pointed at Makena. Dozens of black muzzles and glowing red laser sights were aimed directly at Henry's chest and forehead. Elena shrieked, scrambling backward and tripping over the hem of her crimson gown in a desperate attempt to put distance between herself and the crosshairs. Makena let out a soft, melodic laugh that sent a visible chill down the spines of the elder kappas sitting at the front tables. She gently pushed the envelope across the linen tablecloth, stopping it just short of the glowing candles on her cake. "I don't think I will be signing anything tonight." Henry stood paralyzed, his hands hovering uselessly at his sides as a dozen red laser sights painted his chest. He looked frantically at Marcus, then toward the elder capos, but found no salvation. The ruling council sat in stony silence, watching the power dynamic of the underworld shatter and rebuild itself in real time. Makena set her dessert fork down and dabbed her lips with a linen napkin. Reaching into her sequined clutch, she withdrew a sleek silver remote. With a single press of a button, the towering LED screens behind the head table, previously displaying a gilded monogram for her birthday, went completely black. A heartbeat later, the screens illuminated with cascading lines of data, offshore routing numbers, and heavily encrypted financial ledgers. "You stood here and told the council you built this empire," Makena voiced resonated through the room, cold and precise. "You claimed you financed the war against the Rossi family and funded the Dockland treaties. But empires are built on capital, Henry, and you never had any." Henry's jaw worked silently for a moment before he finally found his voice. Those are syndicate accounts. I secured those investors." "You secured nothing," Makena countered smoothly. She pressed another button. On the massive LED screens, the encrypted ledgers decrypted in real time. The redacted holding companies and anonymous shell corporations dissolved to reveal a single recurring entity, the Sterling Vanguard Trust. A collective murmur swept through the elder capos at the front tables. Carlo leaned heavily over his silver-handled cane, his sharp, weathered eyes darting between the glowing screens and Makena. "Your mother's maiden name?" the old boss rasped, a profound realization dawning on his face. "Exactly, Carlo," Makena nodded gracefully. "Every bullet fired in the Rossi War, every exorbitant bribe paid to the district attorney, every cargo ship purchased for our smuggling routes, it was all underwritten by my family's hidden trust. I was the ghost funder." She turned her dark, unyielding gaze back at her husband. Henry was visibly sweating now, his tailored navy suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. "Lies," Henry sputtered, raw desperation cracking his voice. He pointed wildly at the screens. "I managed the books. I tracked the revenue streams." "You tracked what I allowed you to see," Makena corrected gently, as if speaking to a slow child. "You were given an allowance, Henry. You played the terrifying Mafia boss, while I bankrolled the illusion. I bought you your seat at this table, and tonight I am revoking your lease." Makena didn't give Henry time to recover. She clicked the silver remote a third time. The financial ledgers on the towering screens instantly shifted, replaced by a rapid succession of legal documents, property deeds, and licensing agreements. "You made quite a few promises to your new queen tonight, didn't you, Henry?" Makena asked, her voice echoing with a chilling sweetness. She gestured toward Elena, who was still trembling on the floor, her crimson gown pooled around her like spilled blood. "I believe I heard you mention the coastal cartels, the underground casinos, the sprawling network of dockland smuggling ports that bring in our most lucrative cargo." Henry stared at the screens, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His chest heaved as the red laser sights danced across his chest. "You promised her an empire," Makena continued, her words deliberate and lethal. "But you can't give away what you don't own." On the massive displays, specific clauses within the legal documents were suddenly highlighted in glaring neon yellow. "The Diamond Pearl Casino," Makena recited, though she didn't even glance at the screens. "Deeded exclusively to the Sterling Vanguard Trust, the entire Eastern Seaboard shipping conglomerate, registered under an LLC where I am the sole acting proprietor. Even the mayor and the chief of police, the political assets you boast about controlling, are on retainers paid directly from my private accounts." Elena scrambled to her feet, her haughty confidence completely shattered. She looked wildly at Henry, her voice pitching into a panicked shrill. "Henry, what is she talking about? You said everything was yours."
"It is mine!" Henry roared, though the violent tremor in his voice betrayed his terror. He slammed his fists on the table, desperately ignoring the guns pointed at his head. "Your name is on the streets," Makena agreed, finally standing up. She smoothed the skirt of her emerald dress, moving with the predatory grace of a lioness stepping out of the shadows. "Every brick of this syndicate, every ship in the harbor, every chip on the casino floor belongs to me by legal right." Makena whispered, stopping just inches from him. She leaned in close, her dark eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. "You promised your mistress the world, but as of tonight, Henry, you don't even own the suit on your back."
Carlo, still leaning heavily on his silver-handled cane, rose slowly from his seat at the front table. The scrape of his chair against the marble floor drew the eyes of the entire room, though the glowing red laser sights remained unwaveringly fixed on Henry. "The armistice of last winter," Carlo rasped, his weathered face tight with sudden, startling comprehension. "The Chicago outfits tried to push into our eastern ports. We were braced for a slaughter, a war that would have bled us dry." He looked at Henry, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated disgust. "You walked into that summit a hot-headed thug, and you walked out with a bloodless treaty. We called you a visionary. We thought you had finally learned the art of diplomacy." Carlo shifted his gaze to Makena, his eyes widening with a profound, terrifying respect. It was never him, was it? Makena turned to the elder boss, her expression softening into a look of gracious acknowledgement. "Henry doesn't have the patience for diplomacy, Carlo. He only knows how to hold a gun. I drafted the Chicago armistice. I orchestrated the leverage on their union leaders, and I wrote every single word of the treaty Henry read from his notes." A collective gasp hissed through the ranks of the ruling council. The pieces were finally clicking into place. The brilliant, labyrinthine strategies that had kept the rival families at peace and out of federal crosshairs, strategies completely at odds with Henry's volatile, arrogant nature, had all been authored by the quiet woman in the emerald dress. "The sit-down with the Vega cartel," muttered another councilman, running a hand over his balding head in absolute disbelief. "The sudden shift in the supply chain distributions, none of it was Henry. He couldn't even balance a ledger, let alone architect a tri-state monopoly," Makena said smoothly, her words driving the final nails into her husband's coffin. She looked back at Henry, who was now trembling visibly, sweat beading on his forehead as his entire identity was stripped away in front of the men he claimed to rule. "You were a puppet, Henry," Makena whispered, her voice carrying the absolute weight of a death sentence. "A loud, terrifying mask I wore to frighten the enemies at our gates. But the council isn't blind. They know a masterpiece when they see it, and they finally see the artist holding the brush." Carlo slowly bowed his head, a gesture of deep, unfeigned submission. One by one, the other 4 elder capos followed suit, their loyalty shifting silently and seamlessly in the heavy air of the ballroom. Henry looked at the bowed heads of the ruling council, a strangled, animalistic sound of despair escaping his throat as the true mastermind claimed her rightful place. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of Henry's breathing. He looked at the bowed heads of the ruling council, the men he had arrogantly claimed to own, and realized he was entirely alone. Makena didn't let him catch his breath. She gave a subtle nod to Marcus, the towering head of security who had remained anchored near the locked oak doors. Marcus finally moved. He strode across the polished marble floor, bypassing Henry entirely, and approached Makena. From inside his heavy tactical coat, he withdrew a sleek black velvet box and a thick bound folder of financial statements,
dropping them onto the linen-draped table with a definitive thud. Makena reached out and flipped the velvet box open. A staggering, multi-carat diamond necklace caught the dim atmospheric light, throwing fractured, brilliant prisms across the icing of her untouched birthday cake. Elena, who had managed to pull herself up by clutching the back of a nearby chair, let out a choked gasp. Her hand flew instinctively to her bare collarbone. That's mine," she whimpered, her terrified eyes darting between the glittering jewels and the red laser sights still painted on Henry's chest. "Henry gave that to me in Paris." "He did," Makena agreed, her voice dropping to a lethal, silken purr. "Along with the penthouse in Monaco, the fleet of imported sports cars, and the private jet charters. He has been incredibly generous to you, Elena." Makena picked up the thick folder and slid it across the table toward Carlo. The elder capo slowly straightened up, hooking his silver-handled cane over his arm as he flipped the cover open. But Henry's generosity, Makena continued, her dark eyes pinning her husband in place, came with a fatal flaw. Since he never actually controlled the Sterling Vanguard Trust, his personal accounts couldn't possibly sustain his new lavish lifestyle. Carlo's weathered face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury as his eyes scanned the highlighted routing numbers and bank transfers. He slammed his gnarled fist against the table, rattling the crystal champagne flutes. "This is from the communal treasury, the emergency fund for the families, the widows' pensions." Every diamond around her neck, every chartered flight, every designer gown, Makena confirmed, her tone turning to absolute ice, stolen directly from the syndicate's shared treasury. A dangerous, low growl rose from the tables where the capos and lieutenants sat. The first rule of their dark world, the one unbreakable law that held the violent empire together, was absolute. You do not steal from the family. Henry backed away, his hands raised in a frantic, pathetic gesture of surrender. "No, listen to me. It was a loan. I was going to replace the funds." "You're a thief in the house, Henry," Makena cut him off, her voice ringing out with terrifying finality. "A cheap, desperate thief who robbed his own brothers to play pretend with a mistress."
The outrage over the stolen funds still hung in the air, a volatile cloud ready to ignite. But Makena wasn't finished. She raised a single hand, her emerald sleeve catching the dim light, and the murmurs of the enraged capos instantly ceased. She commanded the room with absolute, effortless gravity. "Stealing from the family is a sin, Henry," she said softly, stepping away from the head table. "But it is a sin of greed. What you did next was a sin of cowardice." Henry froze. His frantic, pathetic justifications died in his throat as a new paralyzing terror washed over his face. "Makena, don't," he whispered, a genuine, desperate plea finally breaking through his shattered arrogance. "Please." She didn't even blink. Makena pressed the final button on her silver remote. The massive LED screens went completely dark, but the state-of-the-art sound system surrounding the banquet hall hummed to life. A hiss of static echoed through the speakers, followed by the unmistakable sound of an encrypted line connecting. "Agent Miller, it's me." The blood drained from the faces of every syndicate member in the room. It was Henry's voice, hushed, frantic, and laced with panic. "I need guarantees, Miller. If I give you the shipping manifests for the coastal cartels, you have to promise I get full immunity. You leave me out of the indictment." Another voice, calm, clinical, and distinctly federal, replied over the speakers. "We need more than manifests. Give us the drop points for the new smuggling routes, and we'll talk about keeping your name off the RICO charges." Fine, I'll give you the coordinates for the docks. Just keep the heat off me." Makena clicked the remote, cutting the audio feed. The silence that rushed back into the ballroom was suffocating, heavier and darker than anything that had come before. Treason.
It was the ultimate betrayal, the one line that once crossed meant a guaranteed brutal death. Henry collapsed to his knees, the laser sights tracking his descent perfectly, settling dead center on his forehead and his chest. He couldn't look at Makena. He couldn't look at the council. He stared blankly at the polished marble floor, entirely hollowed out. You sold the syndicate's secrets to federal agents to save your own skin, Makena stated, her voice ringing out devoid of any warmth or mercy. A rat. Carlos spat, the word carrying the absolute weight of an execution order. Makena looked down at the man who had arrogantly handed her divorce papers just minutes ago. You thought you could discard me and keep the empire, she whispered, but you were already a dead man walking.
Henry remained on his knees, staring at the polished marble as if it might open and swallow him. The crushing reality of his impending execution suffocated whatever defiance he had left. The red laser dots remained anchored to his chest and forehead, unblinking and merciless. A sharp, panicked sob shattered the heavy silence. Elena, trembling violently, finally comprehended the lethal gravity of the room. The man she thought was an untouchable king was nothing but a condemned rat, and standing too close to him was a guaranteed death sentence. Her hands flew to her throat, her fingers clawing frantically at the clasp of the diamond necklace. She tore it off, letting the multi-carat jewels clatter onto the floor, and began to back away. "Elena," Henry croaked, making a pathetic, reaching gesture toward her. She didn't look back. Elena turned and sprinted toward the heavy oak doors, her crimson gown tearing as her heels slipped on the polished stone. Marcus, standing impassively by the exit, caught Makena's eye. Makena gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. The towering head of security unlocked the deadbolts with a heavy clack and pulled one door open just enough for Elena to slip through. She vanished into the hallway, fleeing into the night and abandoning Henry entirely. The doors sealed shut again, locking Henry inside his tomb. Carlo stepped around the head table, the sharp tap-tap of his silver-handled cane echoing like a judge's gavel. The other 5 elder capos formed a loose semicircle behind Carlo, looking down at Henry with cold, dead eyes. "Henry," Carlo spoke, his raspy voice entirely devoid of emotion, "for the crime of high treason, for stealing from your brothers, and for selling our secrets to the feds, you are no longer recognized by this family. Your blood is forfeit. Your name is erased. You are stripped of your rank, your territories, and your life." Henry closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking as he hung his head in absolute defeat. Carlo didn't spare him another glance. The elder boss turned slowly, facing Makena. He lowered his cane, sinking to one knee with a stiff but deeply respectful fluidity. "You are the architect of our survival. The wealth, the strategy, the vision, it was always you." Behind Carlo, the remaining capos and the armed lieutenants lining the walls fell to one knee in a synchronized, breathtaking display of submission. "We swear absolute allegiance to you, Makena," Carlo vowed, bowing his graying head. "The syndicate is yours to command." Makena stood in the breathless silence of the ballroom, looking out over a sea of kneeling men. The most dangerous figures in the city, the absolute elite of the underworld, were all bowing to her. She allowed the moment to settle, the profound shift in power crystallizing in the heavy air, before she offered Carlo a slight, gracious nod. "Rise," she commanded, her voice calm and absolute. As one, the capos and lieutenants stood, their weapons still drawn, but now firmly aligned with their true queen. Makena finally shifted her gaze down to Henry. He was a hollow shell of the man who had arrogantly tossed divorce papers on her birthday table just an hour ago. Stripped of his titles, his stolen wealth, and his illusion of control, he was nothing more than a ghost waiting to be laid to rest. "Marcus," Makena said softly, not breaking eye contact with her ex-husband. The towering head of security stepped forward. He didn't draw a weapon or raise his voice. He simply reached down, grabbed Henry by the collar of his tailored navy suit, and hauled him to his feet. Henry's legs could barely support his weight. He didn't struggle. The fight had completely bled out of him. Marcus dragged him toward the heavy oak doors. As they swung open, the violent, rhythmic drumming of a torrential downpour echoing from the outside terrace flooded the corridor. The storm had finally broken over the city. Henry was pulled out into the cold rain, a dead man walking into the unforgiving night, his frantic whimpers silenced forever as the heavy doors sealed shut behind him with a definitive, echoing thud. Makena turned away from the exit, the dead weight of her past officially banished. She walked deliberately toward the head table. She didn't return to the seat she had occupied all evening. Instead, she moved gracefully to the center of the table, to Henry's former place, and pulled out the heavy, high-back chair. She positioned herself perfectly against the backdrop of the glittering, rain-slicked city skyline. She smoothed the skirt of her emerald dress and sat down. The men in the room stood at perfect attention, holding their breath as they awaited her first command. Makena picked up her crystal champagne flute, the golden liquid catching the ambient light of the candles still burning on her birthday cake. She raised the glass slightly, her dark eyes scanning the faces of her new, utterly loyal council. "To the future," she murmured, taking a delicate sip. And, with absolute, terrifying grace, the queen began her reign. The chapter closes, but the story is far from over. If tonight's episode kept you on the edge of your seat, leave a like and hit subscribe to ensure you never miss the next twist in the narrative. Our stories are unfolding across the globe, and I want to know exactly who is tuning in. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. Until the next episode, stay captivated.